In October 2008, Brazil came to a standstill in the face of a story that at first seemed like just another police case, but quickly turned into something much bigger and far more disturbing. Inside a modest apartment in a housing complex in Santo André, in the ABC region of São Paulo, 4 teenagers lived through hours that felt endless. What should have been an ordinary day became a nightmare unfolding almost in real time, a hostage situation that lasted over 100 hours, surrounded by controversial decisions, serious mistakes, and above all, a media exposure that still raises questions to this day. That's the backdrop of the documentary Caso Eloá, Refém ao Vivo, released on Netflix. But this isn't just a retelling of a crime. It feels as if you're being taken back to that moment, to understand how everything spiraled out of control. On one side, the police trying to negotiate. On the other, an unstable aggressor, emotionally shaken. And in the middle of it all, a 15-year-old girl, Eloá Cristina Pereira Pimentel. The person responsible for the hostage situation was her ex-boyfriend, Lindenberg Fernandes Alves, 22 years old at the time. Unable to accept the end of the relationship, he invaded the apartment where Eloá was with friends and turned that space into a scene of constant tension. As the hours passed, what was already serious became even more delicate and far more dangerous. But what truly marked this case was everything happening outside that apartment. The media coverage was intense, almost non-stop. At times, it crossed basic ethical boundaries. Sensitive information was broadcast live. People directly involved were interviewed. And, in shocking moments, even the kidnapper himself spoke to television programs during the standoff. Meanwhile, millions of people followed every detail as if it were a reality show, without realizing that, inside, real lives were at stake. The documentary dives deep into this fine line between information and spectacle. It doesn't just reconstruct the events, it raises difficult questions. To what extent did the media contribute to worsening the situation? Were the authorities' decisions the best possible? And what could have been done differently? Beyond that, the film brings something even more intimate and heartbreaking. Excerpts from Eloá's personal diary. Simple words, ordinary dreams, the feelings of a teenage girl who had her whole life ahead of her, and whose life was brutally cut short. Through the perspective of her family, the case takes on an even more human dimension. It's not just about a crime that shocked a nation. It's about loss, pain, and the lasting consequences of a tragedy that perhaps could have had a different ending. In the end, what remains is not only the memory of one of the most striking hostage cases in Brazil's recent history. It also leaves a warning, because the Caso Eloá was not just a crime. It was a reflection of human, institutional, and social failures, which, when combined, can turn a critical situation into a tragedy waiting to happen. As the documentary unfolds, journalist Chris Gatas highlights something that would later become one of the most controversial aspects of the entire case: the role of the media in shaping not just the narrative, but, in many ways, the outcome itself. According to the coverage at the time, the first television crews arrived at the residential complex just a few hours after the hostage situation began. What followed was an intense, uninterrupted presence that lasted for more than 5 days. Cameras stayed fixed on the building, reporters delivered constant updates, and the country watched, minute by minute, as 4 teenagers remained trapped inside Eloá's apartment, held at gunpoint under extreme psychological pressure. But this wasn't just reporting anymore. The documentary makes it clear that, at a certain point, the line between journalism and interference began to blur. What was supposed to inform the public slowly turned into a race for exclusivity, for audience, for ratings, for the next headline. And that's where the criticism becomes sharper. Throughout the film, there are strong and direct critiques of how the press handled the situation. In the attempt to secure exclusive information and keep viewers engaged, some journalists went beyond observation. They became active participants in a highly sensitive and dangerous scenario. In one of the most shocking revelations, reporters actually managed to contact the kidnapper by phone, live, during the standoff. Think about that for a moment. While trained negotiators were trying to de-escalate the situation, build trust, and protect the lives inside that apartment, external voices were reaching the aggressor, asking questions, giving him attention, and, in some cases, unintentionally fueling his behavior. The documentary suggests that this kind of exposure may have intensified the instability of the situation. Instead of calming tensions, it potentially added pressure, turning a critical negotiation into something unpredictable and even more volatile. And the criticism doesn't stop with the media. The actions of the police are also carefully examined. Decisions made during those long hours, strategies that were followed, opportunities that may have been missed, all come under scrutiny. The film doesn't offer easy answers, but it invites the viewer to reflect on whether different choices could have changed the course of events. What becomes increasingly clear is that the caso Eloá was not just a hostage situation happening behind closed doors. It was a public spectacle unfolding in real time, with multiple forces acting at once, some trying to resolve the crisis, others, perhaps unintentionally, making it harder to control. And as you keep watching, an uncomfortable question lingers. When everyone is watching and too many people are talking, who is really in control of the situation? As the documentary goes even further, it begins to expose just how deeply flawed the situation had become, not only because of the aggressor, but because of the decisions made around him. At the time, public security experts didn't hold back. They openly criticized the behavior of television networks, especially regarding the interviews conducted with Lindenberg during the hostage situation. Some went as far as calling those actions irresponsible and even criminal. And when you hear that, it forces you to pause. Because this wasn't speculation after the fact. These warnings were being raised while everything was still happening. The idea that a kidnapper, unstable, emotionally charged, and armed, was being given a live platform, attention, and a sense of control was, to many specialists, not just unethical, but dangerous in a very real, immediate way. Yet, the documentary doesn't present this as a one-sided narrative. In a striking moment, one of the journalists involved, the first to successfully interview the kidnapper, speaks openly on camera. There is no hesitation, no visible regret. Instead, he defends his actions. He states clearly that he does not regret what he did, and then he adds something that echoes uncomfortably, that any reporter would have wanted to be in his position. That statement alone reveals a lot. It exposes the competitive nature of live journalism, the pressure for exclusivity, the pursuit of recognition, and how, in extreme situations, those elements can overshadow caution, ethics, and even basic responsibility. But as the documentary carefully shows, the media was only one part of a much larger equation. The actions of the São Paulo police, particularly the elite tactical units known as GATES, Grupo de Ações Táticas Especiais, are also placed under intense scrutiny. Two moments in particular stand out, and they are difficult to ignore. The first is a decision that, even today, continues to shock those who revisit the case. After being released by Lindenberg, Nayara Rodrigues, a friend of Eloá and one of the hostages, was allowed to return to the apartment. Think about that decision for a second. A young girl who had just experienced the trauma of being held captive was sent back into the same high-risk environment, back into the hands of the same armed aggressor. Within the documentary, one of the interviewees delivers a statement that is as blunt as it is haunting. The gate became marked by a hostage situation in which the number of hostages actually increased. And that sentence carries weight, because hostage negotiations are built on one fundamental principle: reduce risk, reduce exposure, preserve life. But here, the opposite seemed to happen. The film doesn't rush to assign blame in a simplistic way. Instead, it lays out the sequence of decisions, the context, the pressure, and the uncertainty that surrounded those moments. It invites the viewer to sit with the discomfort, to question, to analyze, to reflect. Was it a strategic miscalculation, a failure in judgment, or the result of an already chaotic situation spiraling beyond control? As more layers are revealed, one thing becomes increasingly clear. This was not just a crisis caused by one individual. It was a convergence of errors, pressures, and human decisions, each one adding tension to an already fragile situation. And as you continue watching, there is a growing sense that the tragedy was not shaped by a single turning point, but by a series of moments where things could have gone differently and didn't. As the documentary reaches this stage, it begins to feel less like a reconstruction of events and more like a quiet, unsettling investigation into everything that went wrong, step by step, decision by decision. The operation led by GATE, São Paulo's elite tactical unit, becomes one of the central points of reflection. On paper, this is a team trained for exactly this kind of situation: hostage crisis, high-risk negotiations, psychological containment, and controlled intervention. These are professionals prepared to operate under pressure, to slow things down, to prioritize life above all else. But what the documentary carefully reveals is how even specialized structures can falter when surrounded by chaos. And this wasn't a controlled environment. From the very beginning, the case was exposed to an unusual level of interference. The presence of the media, the emotional involvement of the families, the growing public pressure, all of it created a scenario where the operation was no longer isolated. Every move, every delay, every decision was being watched, judged, and, in some cases, influenced in real time. In hostage situations, time is usually an ally. The longer negotiations last, the greater the chances of de-escalation. The goal is to exhaust the aggressor emotionally, to build communication, to reduce tension gradually until a peaceful surrender becomes possible. But here, time seemed to work differently. Instead of calming the situation, the prolonged exposure appeared to intensify it. The aggressor was not isolated, he was connected. He had access to information, to attention, to a sense of visibility that may have reinforced his behavior. And that changes everything. Because a hostage taker who feels seen, heard, even validated, is no longer operating in silence. He becomes unpredictable in a different way. One of the most questioned decisions, as the documentary highlights, was allowing Nayara Rodrigues to return to the apartment after being released. From a tactical perspective, this breaks a fundamental principle: Once a hostage is safe, they should never be reintroduced into a volatile environment. So why did it happen? The film doesn't offer a definitive answer, but it presents possibilities. There may have been an attempt to use her as a communication bridge, someone the aggressor trusted, someone who could help calm him down. In theory, that kind of emotional leverage can sometimes work, but theory depends on control, and control was slipping. By sending her back in, the risk multiplied instantly. The number of hostages increased, the unpredictability increased, the margin for error became even smaller. And that leads to a broader, more difficult question the documentary subtly raises. What should have been done differently? Not just during the operation, but before it ever reached that point. Because incidents like this don't emerge out of nowhere. There are often warning signs, patterns of behavior, emotional instability, possessiveness, difficulty accepting rejection, all elements that, if recognized early, can signal potential danger. The relationship between Eloá and Lindenberg, as the film suggests, may have already shown signs of imbalance and control. In a different scenario with earlier intervention, whether from family, community, or even institutional support, could the situation have been prevented entirely? It's impossible to say with certainty, but the question remains. Once the crisis had begun, best practices in hostage negotiation would typically involve strict isolation of the aggressor, no external communication beyond trained negotiators, no media contact, no information leaks that could alter his perception of the situation, a controlled perimeter, clear communication channels, psychological strategy guiding every interaction. Instead, what happened was almost the opposite. The aggressor was exposed to multiple voices. The situation became fragmented. The negotiation lost its exclusivity, and with that, a degree of its effectiveness. And then there's the final phase of the operation, the moment when negotiation is no longer enough and tactical intervention becomes necessary. These moments are always the most critical. They demand precision, timing, coordination, and, above all, clarity. Every second matters. Every movement carries consequences. The documentary approaches this part with care, but also with weight. It doesn't sensationalize it. It lets the gravity of what happened speak for itself, because by that point, the situation had already been stretched to its limit. Looking back, what makes this case so impactful isn't just the tragedy itself, but the accumulation of small fractures along the way. Moments where protocol could have been stricter, moments where exposure could have been reduced, moments where decisions, even if well-intentioned, may have increased the risk. And that's what lingers, the understanding that this wasn't a single failure, it was a chain, a sequence of choices, pressures, and circumstances that, when combined, led to an outcome that perhaps, just perhaps, could have been different. Not easily, not simply, but possibly. And that possibility is what makes the story so difficult to forget.